I want you to look at something with me right now. While the cameras were pointed at Islamabad last weekend, while the world was watching JD Vance shake hands and issue statements about grand deals and hopeful progress, something else was happening. Something that has received almost no serious analysis. Something that tells you far more about who controls this war than any diplomatic communique ever will. On Tuesday, April 15th, as Israel and Lebanon were sitting down for their first direct negotiations in Washington in over 3 decades, Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel, not after the talks, not before the talks as some kind of warning, during the talks. At 6:15 in the evening local time, while Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors were seated across from each other inside the State Department building on C Street, Hezbollah launched rockets targeting 13 Israeli settlements in the Upper Galilee. That is not a coincidence. That is a statement. And I need you to understand what that statement means, because it is the key to understanding every single thing happening in this region right now. Here is what the mainstream coverage is missing. Everyone is focused on the ceasefire. Everyone is asking whether the talks will succeed, whether the ceasefire expires on April 21st or gets extended, whether Trump's blockade of Iranian ports will force Tehran back to the table. These are real questions, but they are the wrong questions. The right question is this: why does Hezbollah still have the capability to fire rockets at 13 Israeli settlements 47 days into a war in which the most powerful military alliance in human history has been striking Lebanon continuously since March 2nd? Why, after more than 3,500 targeted strikes, after the IDF claims to have destroyed over 200 Hezbollah rocket launchers and killed more than 1,500 operatives, is the rate of rocket fire not decreasing? Why is it increasing? The answer is not what Israeli briefings suggest. The answer is not what Washington wants to acknowledge. And when you understand it, you will see that Hezbollah has not been activated as a desperation move. Hezbollah has been activated as a structural constraint, a constraint on every deal that Trump thinks he is close to making, a constraint that Iran has designed to be impossible to remove from the outside, a constraint whose most important function is not military, it is diplomatic. It is the one condition that can collapse any agreement negotiated in Islamabad before the ink dries. Subscribe now if you are not already, because what I am about to walk you through is the operational logic that the negotiations are going to run directly into, and nobody in the mainstream is explaining the mechanism. Let us start with what actually happened in March, because the timeline is everything. On February 28th, the United States and Israel struck Iran. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and sent the IRGC into its third rung of leadership inside of 6 weeks. For 39 days, American B-2s and Israeli F-35s struck over 13,000 Iranian targets. Petrochemical facilities, steel plants, military infrastructure, the digital security center of Sapa Bank, the institution that pays IRGC salaries. CNN reported on April 15th, quoting a U.S. official directly, that Iran has no money. That official's exact words were, "Iran has no money. They're broke. We know it. And they know we know it." On March 2nd, 4 days after the first strikes, Hezbollah began firing rockets into northern Israel. Now I want you to notice the precision of that date. The November 2024 ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah had held for months. Then, the moment Iran came under direct military attack, Hezbollah activated on the second day, not the third day, not the following week after some deliberation, the second day. That timeline tells you the activation was not reactive. It was pre-planned, pre-coordinated, and pre-positioned. The trigger was not a decision made in Beirut. It was a decision made years ago in Tehran when Iran's strategic planners concluded that the only credible deterrent against an American-Israeli strike on Iran itself was an automatic, pre-committed response from Lebanon that could not be called off by any subsequent diplomatic contact. This is what strategists call a commitment device. And Iran has built one of the most effective commitment devices in modern military history. Here is the operational architecture. Hezbollah, according to the AJC and Israeli military assessments, still maintains an arsenal of roughly 20,000 rockets and missiles even after the current campaign. Before this war, the estimates ranged as high as 150,000. The numbers matter less than the logic. The logic is that Hezbollah's arsenal was never designed to win a conventional military exchange with Israel. It was designed to impose a volume of fire that Iron Dome cannot economically or physically sustain. U.S. officials told Defense Security Asia prior to this conflict that parts of the Iron Dome system would struggle to handle an increased attack of guided missiles and rockets if a large-scale war erupted. An Iron Dome interceptor costs between $70,000 and $100,000. A Hezbollah Katyusha costs a fraction of that. At volume, the economics destroy the defender. The Alma Research Center, analyzing Hezbollah's March 2026 operational patterns, documented a distinct rhythm. Nearly every day features dozens of rocket fire waves, with occasional surges exceeding 40 attack waves per day. And this is Hezbollah operating at reduced capacity, with the IDF conducting continuous strikes in southern Lebanon. The IDF's own sources told the Jerusalem Post in March that they were not optimistic about finding a majority of rocket launchers before they could fire. The launchers, the Post reported, are now north of the Litani River, beyond much of the IDF's operational range. You can strike what you can find. You cannot suppress what you cannot locate before it fires. Received. That is announcement one. Hezbollah's rocket capability has not been degraded to the point of irrelevance. It has been managed. There is a difference. And that difference is what every negotiator in Washington is now trying to paper over. Announcement two. Lebanon is not a sideshow. Lebanon is the linchpin. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf made this explicit publicly on April 11th. His statement, reported by Al Jazeera, was direct. Tehran will not engage in negotiations without a ceasefire in Lebanon, not as a preference, as a condition. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi made the same point through different language throughout the Islamabad talks. Iran's 10-point negotiation plan, the one Vice President Vance reportedly called a basis for discussion before his own team walked that back, included as a core demand an end to Israel's attacks on Hezbollah. Here is why this is structurally different from any other negotiating demand. Every other Iranian demand, the nuclear enrichment question, the frozen assets, the Strait of Hormuz tolls, these are issues where compromise is arithmetically possible. You can negotiate a 20-year enrichment pause down to 10 years. You can split the frozen assets question. You can construct a Hormuz access framework with Iranian sovereignty nominally preserved. These are transactional questions. They have numbers. Numbers can be bridged. The Hezbollah question has no number. Israel has told the Lebanon talks in Washington explicitly, according to Israeli media reports and confirmed by Al Jazeera, that it attended those talks with instructions not to agree to a ceasefire. Israel's ambassador Yechiel Leiter called the discussion a wonderful exchange and described Lebanon making it very clear they would no longer be occupied by Hezbollah. What he did not say was that Israel agreed to stop striking southern Lebanon while that disarmament process supposedly unfolds, because it has not agreed to that. It will not agree to that. Netanyahu announced on Wednesday that Israeli forces were about to seize the Hezbollah stronghold of Bint Jbeil and that he had instructed forces to extend the security zone eastward to the slopes of Mount Hermon. Extending a security zone is not ceasefire behavior. Extending a security zone is annexation behavior framed as security. So what you have is this. Iran says no deal without Lebanon ceasefire. Israel says no ceasefire in Lebanon, period. The United States says Lebanon is a separate skirmish and is not part of the Iran ceasefire. And Hezbollah says the talks between the Lebanese government and Israel are futile, a free concession, and a betrayal of the national interest. While simultaneously firing rockets at 13 settlements on the day those talks began, every one of those positions is structurally incompatible with a durable agreement, and the ceasefire expires on April 21st. 5 days from today, this is what Washington is calling very close to over. Received. That is announcement 2. Announcement 3. The blockade is not the pressure instrument Washington believes it is. On Monday, April 14th, after the Islamabad talks collapsed after 21 hours without agreement, Trump announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz. The White House framed this as a pressure escalation designed to force Iran back to the table on American terms. One U.S. official quoted by Axios was explicit about the logic. Iran earns roughly $140 million per day from oil exports. The blockade zeroes that out overnight. Karg Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude exports, sits 400 miles from the strait. Under the blockade, it effectively shuts down. In theory, this is maximum economic pressure. In practice, something different is happening. Reuters reported on Tuesday, April 15th, citing data from LSEG, Marine Traffic, and KPLR, that a U.S.-sanctioned Chinese tanker passed through the strait in spite of the naval blockade. One vessel. That one vessel is not an accident. It is a probe. China buys over 90% of Iranian oil exports. The entire logic of the sanctions and the blockade is premised on China complying with American enforcement, or at minimum, not actively circumventing it. When a Chinese-flagged sanctioned tanker transits the strait while an American naval blockade is theoretically in effect, China is sending a message that it has sent before on Iranian sanctions and will send again. The enforcement is conditional. The pressure is partial, and there is a second structural constraint. IRGC commanders have stated publicly that American military vessels entering the Strait of Hormuz will be considered a ceasefire violation. Trump responded on Truth Social by threatening to eliminate any Iranian ships that come near the blockade, using the same language he has used about drug smugglers in the Pacific. The ceasefire is supposedly still in effect until April 21st. The blockade is unambiguously an act of economic warfare. Iran's IRGC has defined it as a ceasefire violation. One miscalculation in the strait one Iranian patrol boat that comes too close to a U.S. Navy vessel, one incident that the insurance markets read as renewed hostilities, and the entire architecture of the April 7th truce collapses in a single afternoon. Iran's national petrochemical company suspended all exports until further notice on April 15th to prioritize domestic supply after 39 days of American and Israeli strikes. That is not a country operating from a position of strength. But it is also not a country with no options. A country with no options does not have pre-positioned rockets in Lebanon. A country with no options does not have submarines on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz. A country with no options does not have Hezbollah firing rockets into 13 Israeli settlements on the exact day that Lebanon sits down to negotiate with Israel for the first time in 33 years. Received. That is announcement 3. Now, let me tell you what is really happening behind all of this, because there are two separate games being played simultaneously, and the gap between them is where the danger lives. The first game is the one Trump is playing. Trump wants a deal. His Fox Business interview on Wednesday was clear. The war is very close to over. He has said this before. He has been wrong before, but his desire is real. His economic incentives are real. The IMF cut its UK growth forecast to 0.8% on Tuesday, attributing the downgrade almost entirely to the energy cost shock from this war. The American CPI for March showed inflation at 3.3% driven by energy costs. Gas prices in parts of the United States doubled in 5 weeks. There is a midterm cycle coming. There is a political clock running. Trump's negotiating team, Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner, has been on phones and exchanging draft proposals with Iranians and mediators around the clock since Saturday. Axios confirmed on Wednesday that both the U.S. and Iran have given an in-principle agreement to extend the ceasefire to allow for more diplomacy. The framework is close enough that both sides do not want to be seen as the side that blew it up. The second game is the one Hezbollah is playing. And this is the game that nobody in the mainstream analysis is properly accounting for. Hezbollah does not want a deal on the terms being discussed in Islamabad. Hezbollah's Secretary General Naim Qassem urged Lebanon to cancel the Washington talks. He called them a free concession. He called them futile. Not because Hezbollah is irrational, because a deal that ends the Iran war without a Lebanon ceasefire leaves Hezbollah exposed to continued Israeli strikes under the framework of the 2024 agreement, which Israel has already demonstrated it will violate by maintaining a military presence in southern Lebanon and extending the security zone eastward. From Hezbollah's perspective, any Iran deal that does not include Lebanon ceasefire is a deal in which Iran trades Hezbollah's security for Iranian survival. And Hezbollah's rocket fire since March 2nd has been the operational signal that this trade will not happen quietly. April 8th is the number that proves the point. That was the day after the ceasefire was announced between the U.S. and Iran. Israel launched 100 airstrikes across Lebanon in a single day, including in the heart of Beirut, killing more than 350 people. It was one of the deadliest single days of the Lebanon campaign. Hezbollah responded by continuing to fire. The ceasefire did not reach Lebanon. The killing did not stop. The rockets did not stop. This is the bind Trump is in. He cannot deliver a Lebanon ceasefire because Netanyahu has told his security cabinet Israel is not agreeing to one. He cannot deliver a deal with Iran without a Lebanon ceasefire because Iran has made it a condition. He cannot force Israel to stop in Lebanon without fracturing a domestic political coalition that has already survived multiple crises. And he cannot let the April 21st ceasefire expire without a framework, because that takes the U.S. back to active warfare at a moment when the stock market just hit record highs on investor optimism that a deal was coming. Now, here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud, but it is already showing up in your energy bill, your grocery receipt, and your freight costs, whether you have been paying attention to Lebanon or not. The Strait of Hormuz carried 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas in peacetime. Since March 2nd, shipping through it has fallen by 95% according to Al Jazeera, citing maritime monitoring data. Oil prices have moved on every single twist in the negotiation. The IMF's April warning was not rhetorical. The global recession scenario is on the table. American manufacturers are paying energy prices that their Chinese competitors are not. And the blockade that Trump announced Monday has added a new layer of insurance market uncertainty that keeps commercial shipping away from the strait even when Iranian vessels are technically allowed to transit. Every day that Hezbollah fires rockets into northern Israel, every day that the Lebanon ceasefire is off the table, every day that the gap between Iranian and American demands on enrichment, frozen assets, and Hormuz control remains unresolved, that uncertainty persists. And uncertainty in shipping insurance markets costs money. Not hypothetically, operationally, the ships are not moving. The rockets that Hezbollah fired at 6:15 on Tuesday evening have already reached into your energy costs, whether you know their names or not. Let me now give you the 3 scenarios that determine what the next chapter looks like. The first scenario is the extended ceasefire framework. Both sides agree to extend the April 21st deadline. The US and Iran go back to Islamabad or Geneva, both of which are on the table according to CNN sources. They produce a partial framework, a 10-year enrichment suspension, a modified Hormuz access arrangement that preserves nominal Iranian sovereignty, and frozen asset releases tied to compliance milestones. The Lebanon question gets deferred, explicitly or implicitly. Hezbollah continues to fire rockets at a lower rate. Israel continues to strike southern Lebanon. The humanitarian situation in Lebanon does not improve. The insurance markets partially reopen. Oil stabilizes in the $90 to $100 range. Neither side claims full victory. Both sides claim they held their red lines. This is the most likely outcome in the next 2 weeks, but it is not peace. It is a temporary suspension of maximum pressure that leaves every structural driver of this conflict intact. The Lebanon question deferred is the Lebanon question waiting to explode the next agreement, just as it has already fractured this one. The second scenario is collapse. The ceasefire expires April 21st without extension. The U.S. presses ahead with the blockade. Iran activates Hezbollah to a higher rate of fire. Israel interprets that escalation as justification for a major new offensive in Lebanon. One of the Ghadir submarines the IDF has been unable to locate activates in the strait. A commercial vessel is damaged. The insurance market closes permanently. Brent crude passes $150. The IMF's worst-case scenario activates. Trump faces a military decision he has been trying to avoid for 7 weeks with no diplomatic cover remaining. This scenario is not the most likely, but it is not remote. The gap between the U.S. demand for a 20-year enrichment pause and Iran's offer of a 5-year suspension, documented by CNN sources who were in the room in Islamabad, is not a rounding error. That is a 15-year disagreement. The blockade escalation since Monday has not narrowed that gap. It may have widened it. The third scenario is the muddled continuation. This is the one I want you to watch for, because it looks like progress while changing nothing. Both sides agree to extend the ceasefire. Talks restart but produce no agreement on the core issues. The ceasefire gets extended again. Israel continues striking Lebanon. Hezbollah continues firing rockets. The humanitarian situation in Lebanon deteriorates further. The 2,024 Lebanese dead as of April 15th becomes 2,500, then 3,000. The displaced million becomes more. Iran's economy continues to deteriorate. The strait remains commercially unviable. The global energy shock becomes a chronic condition rather than an acute crisis. 6 months from now, the situation looks structurally identical to today, except that everyone has habituated to the damage and stopped counting it as emergency news. This is the scenario that produces the least dramatic headlines and the most lasting harm. It is also, in my reading of the current trajectory, the one the structural incentives are pointing toward. Here are the questions I want you to take away from this analysis. If Hezbollah fired rockets into 13 Israeli settlements on the same afternoon Lebanon sat down for the first direct talks with Israel since 1993, what does that tell you about Hezbollah's read on whether those talks will produce anything that addresses their core concerns? And if Hezbollah's read is correct, what does that mean for the sustainability of any Iran deal that is built on the assumption that the Lebanon question has been resolved and the harder question? The ceasefire expires in 5 days. The U.S. and Iran have given an in-principle agreement to extend it, according to AP and Axios, as of Wednesday. But in principle is not signed. The gap on nuclear enrichment is documented and real. The gap on Lebanon is structural. The gap on the strait is existential for both sides. Trump says it is very close to over. Close is not over. And the distance between close and over, in the Strait of Hormuz, in the streets of southern Lebanon, and in the northern Israeli settlements that woke up to rockets on Tuesday evening, while diplomats talked about sustainable peace, is still measured in lives. Somewhere in southern Lebanon right now, rocket launchers are positioned north of the Litani River, beyond the IDF's sustained operational range. Somewhere in the Persian Gulf, submarines are resting on the seabed. The ceasefire expires in 5 days. The talks have not resumed. The blockade is in effect. And the most powerful military alliance in the world is asking for 2 more days. Tell me in the comments what you think breaks first, the ceasefire, the talks, or the blockade. I read every single one. Subscribe now if you are not already, and turn on notifications because the next update on this one is going to matter. We will see you then.